Jason and his friends had always been the adventurous type. Late-night drives, exploring eerie places, and testing their courage were all part of the fun. On a cold autumn night, they decided to embark on one of their infamous road trips, searching for thrills off the beaten path. This time, the destination was an old highway deep in the woods, rumored to be haunted by the restless spirits of travelers who never made it home. They laughed off the warnings, confident that it was nothing but urban legend. As they drove, the thick canopy of trees loomed overhead, casting eerie shadows under the pale moonlight. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for their car to squeeze through, and the further they went, the denser the woods became. The silence outside was deafening. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the hum of the engine and the occasional nervous chuckle from the back seat. "Are we sure this is the right road?" Sarah, Jason's girlfriend, asked from the passenger seat, her voice tinged with unease. "Yeah, it's exactly where the map said it would be," Jason replied, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Mike, sitting in the back, was the first to notice something strange. "Is it just me, or has it gotten colder?" Jason glanced at the dashboard. The temperature outside had dropped dramatically, and their breath was starting to fog up the windows. The car's heater, which had been blasting just moments before, now only blew out cold air. Jason shrugged it off, trying to keep the mood light. "It's just the night air. Don't worry about it." But as they pressed on, the unsettling feeling grew. They hadn't seen another car for miles, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly into the dark, like a tunnel with no exit. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches scratching against the car as if trying to grab hold. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. "Jason, look out!" Sarah screamed. Jason slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. Heart racing, he blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a woman, her dress tattered and dirty, her hair wild and tangled, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road, staring straight at them. "Who the hell is that?" Mike whispered, leaning forward from the back seat. "Maybe she's lost," Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Jason hesitated, his hand on the door handle. "Stay in the car," he said, his voice low and tense. But before he could step out, the woman disappeared. "What the?" Jason muttered, looking around wildly. She was gone, just like that. No sound, no movement, just gone. "Where did she go?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jason replied, trying to keep his composure. "Maybe we imagined it." But they all knew what they saw. The atmosphere in the car had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy with an unseen presence. Jason decided to keep driving, eager to put some distance between them and whatever had just happened. As they continued down the road, the darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing the headlights. The radio, which had been softly playing earlier, suddenly crackled to life, a distorted voice whispering through the static. "Turn back." Sarah's hand shot to the radio, trying to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Turn back now." Jason turned the volume dial furiously, but it didn't change a thing. He slammed his hand against the dashboard in frustration, but the voice continued, growing more menacing with every word. Then, without warning, the car jerked violently to the side as if something had slammed into it. Jason swerved, fighting to keep control of the wheel. The car skidded to a stop at the edge of the road, tires kicking up gravel. "What the hell was that?" Mike shouted, clutching the back of the seat. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the road ahead. Nothing. There was no animal, no debris, nothing that could have caused the car to swerve like that. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Jason put the car in gear and tried to drive, but the engine sputtered and died. He turned the key again and again, but the engine wouldn't start. Suddenly, they heard a soft whispering, like a chorus of voices just beyond the trees. It grew louder, surrounding them, filling the car with an oppressive weight. Then came the tapping, slow and rhythmic, against the windows. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with terror. Jason didn't respond. He was staring at the rearview mirror, his face pale as a ghost. Sarah followed his gaze, and her heart dropped into her stomach. There, standing just behind the car, was the woman. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She was joined by others, men, women, children, all of them pale and lifeless, their eyes fixed on the car. "What do we do?" Mike asked, his voice barely audible. Jason didn't have an answer. The figures began moving closer, their hands reaching out for the car, their whispers filling the air with promises of death and despair. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. "We have to go, now," Sarah screamed. Jason turned the key one last time, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning as the car lurched forward. The figures vanished into the darkness behind them, but the whispers lingered, following them as they sped down the road. They didn't stop driving until they reached the safety of the main highway, the haunted road far behind them. None of them spoke a word the entire way home. But they all knew the truth. Something was out there on that road, something dark and malevolent. And they had barely escaped with their lives. They never took another road trip again. It was a typical summer evening when Jake, Liam, and Abby decided to take a spontaneous road trip. They had been cooped up in their small town for months and craved the freedom of the open road. The plan was simple: drive all night, see where the road takes them, and find a random spot to camp under the stars. Little did they know, their journey would lead them to a place far darker than they could have ever imagined. "Hey, check this out," Jake said, pointing to a map on his phone. "There's an old highway that cuts through the mountains. Barely anyone uses it anymore, but it'll save us a couple of hours." Liam, always the adventurer, grinned. "Sounds perfect. Less traffic, more adventure." Abby, sitting in the back seat, hesitated. "Are you sure? That sounds kinda sketchy," Jake laughed. "Come on, ABS. It's just a road. What's the worst that could happen?" As they turned onto the old highway, a thick fog began to roll in. The setting sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. The trees on either side of the road stood tall and dense, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The further they drove, the more isolated they felt, as though they were leaving the world behind. Hours passed, and the fog grew denser. The headlights barely pierced the thick veil of white, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "This fog is insane," Liam muttered, squinting at the road. "I'm starting to think we should have stayed on the main highway," Abby said, her voice tense. Jake shrugged, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We'll be fine. It's just a little fog." Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the middle of the road. "Jake, stop!" Abby screamed. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere inches from the figure. Heart racing, they all stared out the windshield. The figure stood perfectly still, a man, draped in a long coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. "What the hell is he doing out here?" Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the man stepped forward. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Jake honked the horn, hoping to scare him off, but the man didn't flinch. "Let's get out of here," Abby urged, fear creeping into her voice. Jake put the car in reverse, but as he did, the man raised his head. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes empty, black voids locked onto theirs. A cold chill ran down Jake's spine. Without another word, Jake slammed the car into gear and sped down the highway, leaving the man behind. But the further they drove, the more they realized something was wrong. The road didn't seem to end. "What the hell is going on?" Jake muttered, glancing at the GPS. The map showed them driving in circles, even though they hadn't turned once. "This can't be right," Liam said, looking out the window. "We've been driving for hours, and we're still on the same stretch of road." Abby's voice trembled. "What if we're stuck? What if we can't get off this road?" Jake didn't answer. He pressed the gas pedal harder, but no matter how fast they went, the scenery never changed. The trees, the fog, the cracked asphalt, it was like they were trapped in some sort of loop. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. At first, It was just static. But then a voice emerged, low and distorted. "Turn back." Abby's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Jake tried to turn the radio off, but the knob wouldn't move. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Turn back now." Liam's face paled. This can't be happening. The car began to shudder violently, as though something was pulling it off the road. Jake fought to keep control, but the wheel seemed to have a mind of its own. The engine roared as the car veered to the side, crashing through the trees and coming to a sudden stop in the woods. For a moment, everything was silent. "Is everyone okay?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "I think so," Abby replied, though her voice was barely audible. Liam looked out the window, his breath catching in his throat. "Guys, we're not alone." Jake and Abby turned to see what Liam was staring at. Surrounding the car, barely visible through the fog, were dozens of shadowy figures. They stood still, watching, waiting. "We need to go," Abby whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Jake fumbled for the keys, but the engine refused to start. He cursed under his breath, his hands trembling. The figures began to move, slowly closing in on the car. "We're trapped," Liam muttered, his voice hollow. Suddenly, one of the figures pressed its face against the window. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, like the man's from before, were empty voids. It grinned, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Jake slammed his fist against the steering wheel. Come on, come on." The engine sputtered to life, and Jake floored the gas pedal. The car shot forward, plowing through the underbrush and back onto the road. The figures faded into the fog as they sped away, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. They drove in silence, too terrified to speak, until finally, the fog began to lift, and the familiar sight of the main highway appeared before them. Jake exhaled in relief. "We made it." But as they merged onto the main road, something strange caught Abby's eye. In the rearview mirror, just behind them, she saw the shadowy figures once more, standing at the edge of the old highway, watching them leave. "They're still there," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake glanced in the mirror and saw them too. They weren't following, but they were there, waiting for their next victim. They didn't speak of the road trip again, but from that night on, the three friends could never shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. That the highway of shadows was still out there, waiting for them to return.
Road trip, eh?
Lena, Carl, and Marcus had been driving for hours, their road trip taking them through the endless stretches of the desert. The sun had long since set, leaving the barren landscape bathed in the eerie glow of a full moon. They were exhausted, the isolation and monotony of the desert highway beginning to wear on their nerves. "We need to find a place to stay for the night," Lena muttered from the back seat. "I can't keep sitting in this car." Kyle, who was behind the wheel, nodded. "I'll keep an eye out for anything. There's got to be something nearby." As if answering their silent wish, a neon sign flickered to life just up the road. The words Desert Haven Motel buzzed dimly, the lights flickering like they hadn't been maintained in years. Marcus, sitting in the passenger seat, raised an eyebrow. "That looks sketchy. We don't have many options," Lena pointed out, leaning forward between the seats. "Let's just check it out. If it's too creepy, we'll move on." Kyle pulled into the motel's gravel parking lot, the crunch of the stones under the tires the only sound in the quiet night. The building looked old, weathered by years of desert storms and neglect. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting an unsettling green light over the scene. They stepped out of the car, the dry, warm air immediately hitting them. The silence was oppressive, as if the desert had swallowed all sound except for the faint hum of the neon sign. "I don't like this place," Marcus said, his eyes darting around. "It feels off." Lena rolled her eyes. "Come on, Marcus, don't be paranoid. It's just an old motel." The three of them made their way to the front office, which was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. Inside, a man stood behind the counter, his face partially hidden in the shadows. His smile was too wide, too friendly for the circumstances. "Good evening," the man said in a slow, deliberate voice. Looking for a room, Kyle hesitated, glancing at Lena and Marcus, but Lena stepped forward. Yes, we just need a room for the night. The man nodded, his smile never faltering. Of course, we have just the room for you. Room 13. He slid a key across the counter, the metal scraping against the old wood. Marcus chuckled nervously. Room 13, really? The man's smile widened. It's our most comfortable room. I'm sure you'll sleep well. Lena grabbed the key, trying to ignore the unsettling tone in the man's voice. Thanks, she said quickly, ushering Kyle and Marcus out of the office. As they walked toward room 13, the sense of unease grew. The motel was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint whistle of the wind through the cracks in the building. The moonlight cast long shadows across the gravel, making everything look more distorted than it should. This place gives me the creeps, Marcus muttered as they reached the door. Let's just get inside, sleep, and leave first thing in the morning, Kyle replied, unlocking the door. The room was as outdated and worn as the rest of the motel. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the bed looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. A musty smell lingered in the air, and the dim light from the single lamp barely illuminated the space. Lena sighed, dropping her bag onto the bed. Well, it's not the Ritz, but it'd do. Marcus peered into the bathroom and shuddered. If I don't catch some disease in here, it'll be a miracle. Kyle flopped onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. We'll be fine. Just one night. They tried to settle in, but sleep didn't come easily. Lena tossed and turned. Marcus couldn't stop pacing, and Kyle stared at the ceiling, his thoughts clouded with an inexplicable sense of dread. Hours passed, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder, heavier. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. Lena bolted upright, her heart racing. Did you guys hear that? Kyle sat up, rubbing his eyes. Who would be knocking at this hour? Marcus stood by the window, peeking through the curtains. There's no one out there. The knock came again, this time louder and more urgent. I'm not opening it, Lena whispered, her voice shaky. Kyle stood, moving cautiously toward the door. Maybe it's the guy from the office. As he reached for the doorknob, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the room once more, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was thick, oppressive, as though something or someone was just outside, watching. Suddenly, the light flickered, and a cold breeze swept through the room, even though the windows were closed. Lena shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Something's not right, Marcus said, backing away from the window. This place. It feels wrong. Before Kyle could respond, the knocking returned this time, not from the door but from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere. It was as if the motel itself was alive, trying to break through the thin walls that separated them from the outside. What the hell is going on? Lena cried, her voice trembling with fear. The walls groaned, and the knocking grew more intense, more frantic. Shadows began to dance across the walls, swirling and twisting in unnatural patterns. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to shrink, as if the walls were closing in on them. We need to get out of here, Marcus shouted, heading for the door. But when Kyle flung the door open, the hallway outside was gone. Instead, there was nothing but a vast, empty void of blackness so deep and impenetrable that it seemed to swallow the light from the room. There's no way out, Kyle whispered, his voice filled with terror. Lena backed into the corner, her eyes wide with panic. This can't be happening. This can't be real. The shadows on the walls grew darker, forming shapes, figures, people. Their faces were distorted, twisted in agony, their hollow eyes locked onto the three friends. The knocking stopped, replaced by a soft, eerie whispering that filled the room. They never leave, the voices whispered. They never escape. The room began to shake, and the figures on the walls moved closer, their hands reaching out as if trying to pull them into the shadows. We have to do something, Marcus shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the whispers. Lena screamed as the shadows engulfed her, pulling her into the wall. Kyle and Marcus watched in horror as she disappeared, her scream fading into the dark. Kyle grabbed Marcus, shaking him. We have to fight it. We can't let them take us. But it was too late. The shadows closed in around them, the room collapsing into the void. The next morning, the Desert Haven Motel stood empty once again. No trace of the three friends remained, as if they had never been there at all. The neon sign flickered in the early dawn light, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers to arrive. Ben and Olivia were excited for their weekend getaway. They had heard about the scenic countryside and decided to take a quiet road less traveled, away from the bustling highways. It was supposed to be a peaceful drive, just the two of them, windows down, music playing. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, they found themselves on an old, isolated road. The road stretched endlessly into the darkness, with no signs of life in sight. The trees on either side seemed to close in on them, their branches twisting like claws. A thick fog rolled in, making it harder for Ben to see the road ahead. "This doesn't feel right," Olivia murmured, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. "Maybe we should turn back." Ben tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We're almost through, don't worry." Suddenly, the headlights of the car flickered. Then, they went out completely. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in absolute silence. Only the thick, suffocating fog surrounded them. "What the hell?" Ben muttered, trying to restart the car, but the engine refused to respond. Olivia's phone had no signal, and the air grew colder by the second. Panic set in as the oppressive quiet surrounded them. "Ben, I don't like this." As they sat in the pitch-black car, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was dim but slowly growing brighter, coming toward them. Ben leaned forward, squinting through the fog. "Maybe it's another car," he said, relieved. "Maybe they can help us." But as the light approached, they realized it wasn't a car. It was a horse-drawn carriage, like something out of another century. The driver wore a long, tattered coat, and his face was hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. The horses, though pale and ghostly, moved without a sound, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The carriage came to a stop beside them. The driver slowly turned his head, though his face remained hidden in shadow. A cold, raspy voice echoed through the air. "Need a ride?" Ben and Olivia froze, dread washing over them. Before they could respond, the fog thickened, swirling around the carriage. The driver's pale, skeletal hand reached out toward them. "Come with me. It's the last ride you'll ever need." Ben slammed the car door shut, his heart pounding. He tried the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life, as if jolted by sheer terror. Without looking back, Ben sped away, the fog parting just enough to reveal the road ahead. But in the rearview mirror, the ghostly carriage remained, slowly fading into the mist. They never spoke of that night again, but deep down, they both knew they had escaped something far worse than death. Samantha had heard the stories growing up. Everyone in her small town talked about the whispering woods and old, forgotten forest at the edge of town that was said to be haunted. Kids dared each other to go in, but no one ever stayed long enough to find out what was truly inside. One evening, feeling braver than usual, Samantha decided to venture in. The sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the forest, but she felt compelled to go, as if something was calling her. She stepped onto the narrow dirt path, the towering trees creating a canopy overhead. It wasn't long before the whispers began, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but soon, they grew louder. Words soft and unintelligible seemed to surround her. Samantha's heart raced, but she pressed on. Every step she took seemed to echo louder, as if the forest itself was watching her, waiting. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers paused for a moment, replaced by a chilling silence. Then, they resumed, closer this time. She turned around, but no one was there. Her skin prickled as she realized she was not alone. Suddenly, the trees began to creak and groan, their branches bending unnaturally. A shadow darted between them, too quick to see clearly. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as the whispers grew louder, now chanting in a strange, forgotten language. She turned to run, but the path had disappeared. The forest seemed to shift and twist around her, trapping her inside its ancient maze. Panic set in, and she stumbled over roots and rocks, the voices growing louder, closer. In the distance, she saw a figure standing between the trees, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face obscured by a veil. The whispers stopped as the woman slowly lifted her hand, pointing at Samantha. The air grew cold, and a wave of dread washed over her. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her. The woman's veil fluttered in the wind, revealing hollow, empty eyes. Samantha screamed and ran, the forest seeming to close in around her. Just as the whispers reached a deafening pitch, she broke through the trees and collapsed onto the road outside. Gasping for breath, she looked back at the woods. The whispers had stopped, but she could still feel them watching. No one ever went back into the whispering woods, and Samantha would never speak of what she saw. But every night, as she lay in bed, she could still hear the faint whispers calling her back.